They say every river in Georgia remembers, not the names carved into marble, but the ones whispered through blood and soil, that if you walk far enough into the canebrake along the Ogeechee, you'll find what's left of Ashwood Hall. It isn't on any map now, just a scatter of blackened brick and a single chimney that leans like a gravestone, but a century and a half ago, it was the proudest estate in Burke County, a house built on cotton, iron, and fear, and at its heart lived Margaret Ashwood, the widow who never smiled in photographs. Narrator: she came from Charleston money, married young, buried young, and inherited more than land when her husband's heart stopped. Locals said she inherited his sins. Servants called her the quiet mistress, not because she was kind, but because she never raised her voice, not even when the sky split with thunder. Voiceover, cinematic tone. The story begins in the summer of 1848, when the fields burned white with heat and something new began stirring beneath the magnolias. The workers whispered that the house had gone hungry, tools rusted overnight, milk spoiled before dawn, and anyone who slept beneath the west windows woke screaming about footsteps pacing the attic. But Margaret didn't believe in ghosts, she believed in order, and every morning, she wound the same brass clock in her late husband's desk, one turn for every soul who still obeyed her name. Narrator: that clock is what people talk about now when they tell the tale in roadside bars and on ghost tours. They say its ticking could be heard through the entire house, steady as a heartbeat, until the night it stopped, because the night it stopped, Ashwood Hall began to rot from the inside out. The morning after the thunderstorm, the workers found the orchard flooded in silver light, not sunlight, moonlight. The sun had already risen, but the land refused to turn day, and in the middle of that still glow stood Margaret Ashwood, barefoot, her hands black with soot. She said nothing, just turned, walked back inside, and locked every door behind her. Narrator: factual tone, steady rhythm. For 3 weeks, no one saw her leave the house. Meals were left outside her study, the trays returned empty but untouched. Letters arrived from Charleston lawyers unanswered, and the only sound that escaped Ashwood Hall was that same, endless ticking, the brass clock on her husband's desk, counting time no one lived in anymore. When the overseer finally forced the doors open, they found her sitting before the clock, eyes fixed on its face. The glass was cracked, and the second hand twitched instead of turning. She whispered something he could barely hear. "It's slowing down, and I can't stop it." Voiceover, darker tone, building suspense. Later that night, the overseer went missing. His horse returned riderless, foam at its mouth, as if it had galloped from something it couldn't outpace. Margaret said nothing, but when neighbors rode over to check on her, they saw a new portrait hanging in the entryway. A man in a black coat, features pale and unfamiliar, painted in oils that hadn't yet dried. When asked who it was, she only replied, "Someone who was never born, but has always been here." Narrator: slow, haunting tone. The housekeeper quit that same evening. She told the next town over that Ashwood Hall had a hum in its walls, like a clock hidden behind plaster, ticking even when the brass one stopped. And every night, at precisely midnight, the air smelled of iron and ozone, the scent of a storm that never came. Voiceover, analytical, reflective tone. Historians now believe Margaret was suffering from grief, or madness brought on by isolation, but the town didn't see an illness, they saw a curse. A woman who refused to let time move forward, who wound a clock so tightly it began winding the world around her. Closing line, chilling, cinematic tone. And when that clock finally stopped, every bird in the orchard fell silent, and the night refused to end. That was the night they began calling her the widow who outlived time. By autumn, Ashwood Hall was more rumor than home. The cotton fields lay untended, the fences half swallowed by ivy. Children dared each other to touch its gateposts and claimed they could feel them vibrate, as if the earth itself were breathing beneath. Every story in Burke County begins with that night, October 14, 1848. When the air went still for exactly 13 minutes. No wind, no crickets. Even the dogs stopped barking. Narrator, documentary tone. A merchant named Elias Crane recorded it in his journal. I was walking past the Ashwood boundary when my watch stopped, the second hand froze, and a low ringing filled my ears, as though I stood beside a church bell struck once and still ringing inside my skull. He said the moon turned red for those 13 minutes, and when it passed, the air reeked of wet iron, the scent of rusted blood and rain that never fell. Voiceover, slow, foreboding tone. The following morning, 3 of Margaret's workers were found kneeling in the orchard. Their eyes were open, their lips cracked and dry. Each one held a handful of dirt, as though they'd been trying to bury something, or keep something buried. The brass clock sat in the center of the parlor floor, its glass shattered. Its hands gone, and yet, it still ticked. Narrator, investigative tone. When the sheriff arrived he ordered the house sealed, but men who carried the clock out of the parlor said it felt warm, not like metal under the sun, like something alive. One of them swore he heard breathing when he pressed his ear to its back, another claimed the ticking matched his heartbeat, until it didn't. Voiceover, emotional, subdued tone. Margaret was nowhere to be found. No footprints, no trail, only a trail of black ash. Leading to the cellar door, inside, they found dozens of sketches, circles, lines, and unfamiliar symbols scratched into the stone with chalk and bone. At the center of the floor, someone had written 3 words, "It learned me." Narrator, soft, analytical tone. The town tried to bury the evidence, the sheriff burned the papers, sold the land, and forbade anyone from rebuilding there, but fires don't destroy memory, they feed it. Voiceover, cinematic close to the segment. Within a year, anyone who handled that clock was dead, missing, or mad. The new owners abandoned the land, claiming the walls themselves. Whispered in a woman's voice, counting backward from 13, again and again, until dawn. That's when the stories stopped calling her a widow and started calling her the keeper of borrowed hours. The year was 1864, and the Civil War had carved deep wounds across Georgia. Ashwood Hall, once a symbol of Southern wealth, now stood half empty, its grand halls echoing with the sound of boots, whispers, and the distant thunder of cannon fire from Savannah's burning horizon. Union troops had begun their march, leaving nothing but ashes and silence in their wake. The plantation's crops were long gone, the workers scattered or dead, and the few who remained at Ashwood stayed not out of loyalty, but out of fear. The center of that fear was the clock, the same clock that had told midnight on the night of Margaret Ashwood's death. It had survived fire, theft, and years of neglect. Its surface scorched, its glass cracked, yet still it ticked, through the chaos of war, through every sleepless night. Its pendulum swung with unnatural precision. Those who lived in the hall swore that every night, at 12, the clock's bell would toll, but not 12 times. Sometimes it struck 9, sometimes 11, and once, during the siege of Savannah, it rang 13 times. They said that on those nights, a woman's shadow passed through the corridors. Her footsteps were soft, like the swish of silk skirts on old wood, and her voice could be heard whispering a single name, Thomas. When the war finally ended, Ashwood Hall was little more than a ruin. The surviving Ashwood heir, Captain Henry Ashwood, returned from the Confederate ranks carrying a wounded arm and a haunted look. That he found the house exactly as his mother had left it, furniture draped in white cloth, mirrors covered, portraits faded from smoke. The only thing untouched, still standing proud in the drawing room, was the clock. Henry tried to stop it. That he removed its weights, dismantled its gears, even smashed its glass face in a moment of rage. Yet, the following morning, when the first light of dawn crept through the broken shutters, the clock was ticking again. The servants whispered that the widow had claimed it, that her spirit used it as a doorway. Each toll was a heartbeat, each swing of the pendulum, her breath. Henry laughed off such superstition at first, until the dreams began. Every night, he dreamt of the swamp behind the estate. A place his mother had forbidden anyone to go. In his dreams, he walked barefoot through the cypress roots and saw a light, a pale figure standing waist deep in black water, holding something that glimmered like glass. When he tried to speak, she would raise her head and reveal a face with no eyes, only hollow sockets weeping mud. The first morning after such a dream, Henry found his boots soaked with swamp water. The second morning, there was mud on his bedroom floor, and the third morning, his servant, Jonah, found him sleepwalking in the corridor, muttering the words, "I heard her again, she's not gone." By the winter of 1866, Ashwood Hall had become a legend across Burke County. Travelers passing the road claimed they saw candlelight flickering from the upper windows. Though the hall had been abandoned for months, those who dared to enter swore that the clock still ran, and if you listened closely, you could hear the faint sound of a woman crying behind its brass gears. A preacher from Augusta visited once, determined to rid the house of its curse. He prayed in every room, sprinkled holy water on every doorframe, and struck the clock's face with a hammer, shattering the glass completely. When he left, he told the townspeople that evil had been banished from the hall. But that night, the people living nearby heard the bell toll again, not 12 times, but once, just once. A single, deep chime that echoed through the forest for almost a full minute, and when it faded, they said the sound that replaced it was unmistakable. the soft, breathless laughter of a woman who had waited a long, long time. For nearly 30 years after the war, Ashwood Hall slept beneath its own dust. The ivy crept up its brick walls like veins reclaiming a corpse, windows cracked, roofs sagged, and wild dogs made dens beneath the porch where ladies once sipped tea. Locals avoided the place, muttering that the ground was spoiled, that every living thing near it withered, and every clock brought into the house stopped within a day. The Ashwood name faded from polite conversation, surviving only in whispers and half-remembered stories told around firelight. Children dared each other to walk the road that cut past the gate. Some claimed that if you stood there at midnight, you'd hear a woman's lullaby echoing from the trees, sweet, soft, and terribly sad. But in the summer of 1891, curiosity found its way back to Ashwood Hall. The scholar Professor Edwin Merrow of Boston College was a historian who believed that every legend hid a seed of truth, that he specialized in the forgotten corners of American history, the places where fact and folklore blurred together. When he heard rumors of a haunted plantation clock that had ticked without winding for over half a century, he knew he'd found his next paper. Merrow wasn't alone. That he arrived in Burke County with 3 companions: Clara Winslow, his assistant and photographer Silas Reed, a machinist with an obsession for antique mechanisms, and Dr. Jonas Pratt, a physician interested in psychical phenomena. Together they carried notebooks, measuring instruments, and the kind of skepticism born from city living. To them, the Deep South's ghost stories were nothing more than charming relics of a superstitious age. That confidence began to crumble the moment they reached the Ashwood gate. The iron sign over the entrance had rusted away, leaving only the outline of a name no one dared to speak aloud. The drive was overgrown, littered with dead leaves that hadn't been touched by wind in years, and yet, as they walked toward the house, the air felt thick, as though the humidity itself were watching. Clara, usually fearless, paused halfway up the path. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Silas listened. At first there was only the buzz of insects, then, faintly, the steady, mechanical beat of a clock. Tick-tock. Tick-tock. Each click sounded closer than the last, like something pacing alongside them just out of sight. Inside the hall, Ashwood's front doors hung crooked, but they opened easily, as if expecting guests. Dust spiraled in beams of golden light that filtered through the broken windows. Portraits stared down from the walls, their faces faded but their eyes still bright with paint that refused to die. At the center of the grand hall stood the clock. Even after all these years, it looked impossibly clean. Its brass pendulum swung with perfect rhythm, its hands fixed on 11:59. Merrow approached it first, notebook in hand. "This piece," he murmured, "isn't supposed to exist anymore. The craftsmanship, this is pre-war English oak, reinforced brass gears, impossible to run this long without maintenance." He leaned closer. The clock gave a small, almost polite chime, only once, then the second hand began to move again, though none of them had touched it. Clara raised her camera, but the moment she took the picture, the flash bulb exploded, not the bright white of magnesium, but a burst of blue light that left a ring across everyone's vision. When the afterimage faded, the hands of the clock pointed straight to midnight. The first night they decided to camp inside the hall for observation. Merrow insisted on setting up equipment: barometers, thermometers, a phonograph to record sound. Clara catalogued the rooms, each one more suffocating than the last. The air smelled faintly of lilies and old smoke. Dr. Pratt kept glancing toward the staircase. That he swore he heard movement there, the faint rustle of skirts, the sound of someone descending step by careful step. But when he turned, the stairs were empty. At 12:05, the clock told once, then twice, then 13 times. On the 13th chime, every lamp in the house went out. Clara's voice trembled in the dark. "Professor, was that supposed to happen?" No one answered. The air had changed, thicker, colder, smelling faintly of swamp water. When Silas struck a match, its light reflected on the polished brass of the clock, and something else behind the glass, a pale outline of a woman's face, eyes closed, as though sleeping inside the gears. The match burned down to Silas's fingers. He dropped it and cursed. When he looked again, the face was gone. The second night they might have left the next morning if not for Merrow's obsession. That he claimed they were on the brink of discovering temporal resonance, proof that emotion could leave measurable energy behind. That he promised his companions that if they stayed one more night, they'd make history. By dusk, thunder rolled across the swamp. Rain came hard and fast, beating against the windows like fists. Silas tried to document the clock's mechanism, but each photograph blurred, the negative streaked with what looked like fingers pressed against glass. At 11:59, the pendulum stopped, then the entire hall seemed to breathe. Clara later described it as a pulse through the walls, like the heartbeat of something buried deep under the floorboards. Every candle flame bent toward the clock, then the chime began again, slow, deliberate, heavy enough to shake dust from the rafters. On the 12th toll, the door at the top of the staircase creaked open by itself. What they saw in that doorway stood a woman. Her dress was soaked, her hair clinging to her face, and her skin, the color of candle wax, gleamed in the lightning flashes. She didn't walk down the stairs so much as glide, her feet never touching the steps. Clara whispered, "Mrs. Ashwood," and the figure smiled, not a kind smile, a knowing one. The smile of someone who had waited decades for a visitor foolish enough to knock. She raised her hand toward the clock, and every instrument Marrow had set up, every barometer, every phonograph, began to tick in unison. The noise grew louder, merging into one continuous hum until it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating. Then, with a sound like splintering wood, the clock door burst open. Inside, the gears spun backward, faster and faster, until the hands whirled into a blur. Marrow shouted something no one could hear over the noise. The air bent. Light folded in on itself, and the four of them saw, for an instant, what had been hidden for 40 years, a woman in black, kneeling beside a blood-stained clock, whispering, "Time is mercy, and mercy has ended." The storm broke in the same instant that silence returned. When the thunder faded, the clock's hands pointed again to 11:59. Dr. Pratt lay unconscious, his pulse faint but steady. Silas's camera had melted where it Saturday, and etched into the floorboards in front of the clock were 3 words that hadn't been there before: "She still waits." The storm that night was remembered for miles around. Locals swore lightning struck the swamp 17 times before morning, and that the thunder rolled without pause for nearly an hour. But what no one could explain was why, after the storm, no one ever saw Professor Edwin Marrow again. The aftermath: at sunrise, a farmer named Elijah Boone spotted a strange sight from his property 2 miles down the road. A single figure, a woman, was walking barefoot along the flooded track that led away from Ashwood Hall. Her white dress clung to her like a second skin, and she carried something heavy wrapped in a black cloth. Boone called out to her, but she didn't turn. He said later it looked like she was listening to something far off, like a voice carried in the wind. By the time he reached the road, she had vanished. That same morning, a sheriff's deputy from Waynesboro arrived at the hall after receiving a telegram from Boston College. Marrow's assistant, Clara Winslow, had sent it at dawn, her handwriting shaky and uneven. "Professor missing. 1 injured. 1 dead. Please send help. The clock won't stop." The investigation sheriff Daniel Cobb had seen plenty in his 30 years, a war, murders, fires, but nothing like Ashwood. When he stepped through the doors, he said the air felt wrong, like the smell of rain mixed with blood. Inside, they found Dr. Jonas Pratt unconscious near the staircase, pulse weak, his eyes darting beneath his lids as though dreaming. Silas Reed, the machinist, was alive but incoherent, sitting cross-legged on the floor and staring at the clock. When the sheriff tried to question him, Silas only muttered one phrase over and over: "She turned the gears backward, she turned the years backward." Cobb searched every room. Marrow's notebooks were gone, his luggage, his coat, even his hat, all still there, but not the man himself. On the wall behind the clock, scrawled in something dark and dried, was a single message: "Don't wind it again." Clara's account, Clara Winslow's statement, taken 2 days later at the sheriff's office, was the only coherent record of what happened that night. It was written in trembling ink, each line growing less steady than the last. "We heard the 13th chime. The air felt like it was pulling inward, as if the whole house was breathing against us." The professor went closer to the clock. "I begged him to stop. He said, 'Clara, time is only a wound waiting to be opened.' Then he reached inside it, the gears, and his hand disappeared. He screamed once, not in pain, but like someone falling for a very long time. Then the clock stopped. Just stopped. The sound went out of the air. Dr. Pratt fainted. Silas ran to help, but the professor was gone. Only his pocket watch remained, still ticking. Cobb asked her what she did next. Clara said she smashed the glass face of the clock with a lantern, trying to break it completely, but even shattered, it ticked on. that was the last thing she remembered before waking up outside in the rain, her hands covered in mud and blood she couldn't explain. Theories and rumors. The newspapers loved the story. Within a week, headlines across Georgia screamed, "Professor vanishes in haunted plantation. Ghost of widow Ashwood strikes again." Skeptics called it hysteria, blaming exhaustion or swamp gas for their visions. Others claimed Merrill had staged his disappearance for fame, but locals in Burke County told another story, one that grew darker with each retelling. They said on certain nights, when the air was thick and the crickets went silent, a faint blue light could be seen glowing behind the hall's shattered windows, and if you walked close enough, you'd hear ticking, not from the clock itself, but from deep underground. Some said it was Merrill, trapped between seconds, still searching for his way back. Others whispered that the clock had chosen him, just as it had once chosen Margaret Ashwood, that it needed a keeper. The photographer's curse. 2 weeks later, a journalist from the Atlanta Constitution tracked down Clara Winslow in Savannah, where she was recovering at a boarding house, that he wanted a photograph of her to accompany his article. She agreed, reluctantly. When the photograph developed, her image came out clear. But behind her, faint and transparent, was a tall man in a long coat, his face blurred like smoke. The camera had captured no one else in the room. The journalist destroyed the negative immediately. 3 days later, Clara vanished too. The boarding house owner said she left her room sometime before dawn. The only thing she took with her was a small brass gear, the kind used in clock mechanisms. Silas Reed's last experiment. Silas Reed, the machinist, was sent to an asylum in Milledgeville after his breakdown. Doctors said his mind was haunted by rhythmic obsessions. He spent every waking hour drawing clock faces on the walls, each showing a different time, but all missing one number, the number 12. In 1893, he managed to escape during a thunderstorm. 2 days later, authorities found him dead in the woods 5 miles from Ashwood Hall. His body was dry despite the rain, his eyes wide open. In his pocket, they found a single note written in charcoal. It was never time that moved, it was her. A visitor at midnight. By the turn of the century, Ashwood Hall had become an overgrown relic, avoided even by the bravest travelers. But one night in 1902, the caretaker of a nearby property, Mrs. Gilda Boone, claimed she saw a figure standing at the front gates. She described him as tall, dressed in an old brown coat, with spectacles that caught the moonlight. That he looked confused, lost. When she called out, he turned to her, lifted something in his hand, and vanished before her eyes. The next morning, she found footprints in the mud leading up to the hall. At the end of the trail lay an old pocket watch, its hands frozen at 11:59. The clock ticks on. By 1910, the plantation was bought by a timber company that planned to tear it down. They sent a team of 12 men to begin work. Only 9 returned. The survivors refused to speak of what happened, though one, years later in a bar, was overheard saying, "We cut through the wall, and it wasn't brick behind it. It was mirrors. Thousands of little mirrors, and they all showed her face." The hall was abandoned once more, and still, on quiet nights, when fog rolls off the swamp and the air hangs heavy, you can hear it, the faint, relentless rhythm of a clock counting seconds no one remembers. Tick tock, tick tock, each sound a reminder that some wounds never heal, some just learn to keep time. Time moved on, but Ashwood Hall never did. By 1931, most of Burke County had forgotten the old plantation, its name erased from county maps after a fire destroyed the local records office. The land was listed only as Parcel 41B, unclaimed, unsuitable for farming, but that year, the state sent a small team of surveyors to evaluate the swamp for potential logging and road construction. Among them was Robert Hensley, a young civil engineer from Macon. He'd never heard of Ashwood Hall, he wasn't from around here, and the locals didn't speak of it to outsiders. But on the 3rd day of their survey, when they stumbled upon the overgrown gates wrapped in vines and rust, he felt something shift in the air. "It's like the woods stopped breathing," one of the men said quietly, and he was right. Not a bird sang, not a single insect buzzed. The swamp went still, as if waiting. The discovery. The men followed the old road up to what had once been the main house. What they found looked less like a ruin and more like a skeleton, the bones of a building that refused to rot. Its roof had collapsed, the windows were hollow sockets, and the porch sagged like a tired jaw. But in the heart of the house, half buried under vines and fallen beams, they saw it. The clock point. One of the workers, a big man named Joe Mullen, laughed when he saw it. "Well, hell, maybe we can pawn this old thing." Looks fancy enough. Hensley told him to leave it be, but curiosity was stronger than caution. Mullen brushed off the cobwebs, revealing brass that still shone through the grime. When he touched it, the clock gave a faint, hollow chime. Just once. The sound didn't echo, didn't fade, that it just hung there in the air, vibrating like a heartbeat. The men froze. Then, quietly, the pendulum began to move. The uneasy night. The surveyors decided to make camp inside the ruined hall that evening, not because they wanted to, but because the swamp had flooded the trail they came in on. They built a fire in the drawing room and joked nervously to push back the silence. As the night deepened, the firelight flickered over the portraits that still clung to the walls. The faces in those paintings were cracked and fading, but every so often, Hensley could swear he saw the eyes glint, as though they were catching more than firelight. Around midnight, the clock began to tick again. No one had wound it, and no one had even touched it since. Earlier, Joe Mullen stared at it uneasily. "Ain't natural," he muttered. Another man laughed. "It's just old gears moving. Metal contracts in the cold." But when the first chime came, every flame in the room dimmed to a dull orange. The sound was not metal, it was a voice, a low, drawn-out tone that carried something almost human beneath it, like someone humming through teeth. Then came another chime, and another, each deeper than the last, until it seemed the floor itself was groaning with the weight of it. By the 13th toll, the men could barely breathe, the air thickened like syrup, and the shadows stretched long across the floor, reaching toward the clock as though pulled by invisible threads. The floor gives way. Then the sound stopped. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, from somewhere deep under the floor, came a crack, followed by a low, wet sound like wood splitting under pressure. The boards beneath the clock sagged. Hensley grabbed his lantern and shone it down, expecting rot or a sinkhole, but what he saw made his stomach drop. Beneath the floorboards was a pit, narrow, deep, and lined with something pale. At first he thought it was stone, then he realized it wasn't, that it was bone, dozens of them, skulls, ribs, femurs, some small as a child's, others long and twisted like they'd been warped by heat. They weren't buried. They were arranged, stacked in a spiral pattern, circling a wooden crate that looked far too new to have been placed there during the war. Mullen whispered, "Jesus, what is this place?" No one answered. When they pried open the crate, they found an iron mask inside, shaped like a woman's face, its mouth sealed shut, its eyes hollow. Beside it lay a rotted scrap of parchment, the ink still faintly legible, for she would not stay buried. The voice below the men tried to cover the pit, but the ground seemed to breathe beneath them, shifting with each step. The wind outside rose, though no trees bent with it. Then, faintly at first, they heard a voice. It was soft, almost a sigh. A woman's voice. "You brought the light back." Joe Mullen dropped his lantern. The flame hit the floor and spread fast across the dry boards. The men panicked, some running for the door, others trying to stamp out the fire, but the clock didn't burn. Even as the walls caught flame, even as smoke filled the hall, it stood untouched, its pendulum swinging faster and faster, and through the roar of fire, they all heard it again, louder this time. "You shouldn't have come back." The escape. By dawn, the hall was gone, burned to a blackened shell. 3 of the surveyors escaped with minor injuries. Joe Mullen was not among them. Hensley searched for him for hours, calling through the smoke and ashes until he found what was left of the pit. The bones were gone, the crate was gone, only the clock remained, half buried in soot, still ticking. That he left that day and never spoke of what he saw, not in reports, not to his superiors, but years later, when his daughter cleaned out his attic. After his death, she found a notebook labeled Ashwood. Inside, the pages were covered in strange, looping sketches, spirals, gears, and the outline of a woman's face with no mouth. At the bottom of the last page, one sentence stood out, written in red pencil: "It's not a haunting. It's a hunger." The revival. The land lay empty again for nearly half a century, but the clock, somehow, survived. In 1982, a collector named Howard Merton, known for restoring Civil War antiques, bought the property at auction. He planned to build a museum on the site, dedicated to Southern heritage and craftsmanship. When Merton's team began clearing debris, one of the workers found a large brass clock half buried near the foundation. Merton, delighted, had it cleaned and mounted in his workshop in Atlanta. He told friends it was the finest piece of pre-war engineering he'd ever seen. That same week, he suffered recurring dreams of a woman standing in a flooded hallway, whispering through sealed lips. Every night, the dream ended the same way. She raised her hand, touched his chest, and whispered, "You turned it on." When Merton awoke, the clock in his study would be ticking, and always, its hands pointed to the same time, 11:59. The interview tape in 1983, a local historian named Mary Collins interviewed Merton for a documentary about haunted relics. The original tapes were never aired, but a transcript surfaced years later, pieced together from the surviving audio. Collins: "You said the clock keeps perfect time?" Merton: "Not exactly. It keeps its time. It doesn't stop. It doesn't wind down." Collins: "Have you ever taken it apart?" Merton: "Once. But there's something inside the casing, something sealed behind the pendulum." Collins: "What do you mean, sealed?" Merton: "Like another layer of metal. Or bone. It's porous. It's warm." Collins: "Warm?" Merton: "Yes. As if it's breathing." The tape ended abruptly with a high-pitched whine, followed by silence. 2 days later, Mary Collins visited Merton's workshop to follow up. She found the door unlocked, the lights on, the clock stood in the center of the room, still ticking. Howard Merton was gone. On the wall behind the clock, etched in soot, were the faint words, "The widow wakes." By the late 1980s, Ashwood Hall was nothing more than a charred memory, just a patch of swamp where even weeds refused to grow. But the clock never died. It moved from one owner to another, from attic to auction house, its trail cold and broken, until no one could remember where it came from. By 1997, it resurfaced quietly, listed in a private collector's catalog as Victorian Grandfather Clock, Unknown Origin, Unrestored Condition. Lot #111. The winning bidder was Dr. Lillian Frost, a historian from Emory University specializing in postbellum Southern folklore. To her, it was just an artifact, until it began to speak. The academic Dr. Frost was known for her calm, rational approach. She'd spent her career debunking ghost stories, exposing hoaxes, and cataloging myths of the Reconstruction era. So when she received the clock at her Atlanta townhouse, she treated it like any other relic. She noted the materials, cataloged the damage, and set it in her study for further analysis. For the first week, nothing unusual happened, except the ticking. Even though the clock had no weights, no pendulum chain, and no signs of recent maintenance, it kept perfect time. That intrigued her more than frightened her. Then, one night, at exactly 11:59 p.m., she heard something new. A second sound behind the ticking, faint, but unmistakable. It was breathing, slow, deliberate, measured breaths, in perfect rhythm with the pendulum, inhale on the tick, exhale on the tock. She thought it must be an auditory illusion, stress, exhaustion, the brain filling in patterns where none existed. But when she leaned close to inspect the mechanism, she swore. She saw condensation bloom briefly on the inner glass, as though something inside had exhaled. The recording. Being a scientist first, Dr. Frost decided to record it. She set up an old cassette deck beside the clock and let it run overnight. The next morning, she played the tape. For the first 5 minutes, only the rhythmic ticking filled the speakers. Then came a faint whisper. A woman's voice. It was nearly inaudible, but with headphones, Frost could make out the words, "You brought the light back." The same words spoken to the surveyors nearly a century earlier. At first, Frost thought it might be an old broadcast or interference, until the voice said her name, Lillian. She stopped the tape and stared at the machine. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the last few seconds. The final word whispered through the static, "Help me." The letter. 2 days later, Frost wrote to her mentor, Professor Harold Crane, at Tulane University. Her letter was short but urgent. "I believe I've found an artifact with active psychical resonance. It appears to respond to light, time, and proximity. I cannot explain it through mechanical means. Please come soon. I don't feel safe." Professor Crane arrived in Atlanta 3 days later. When he entered her townhouse, the first thing he noticed was the smell, lilies, rotten and sweet. He found the clock in the study, its glass fogged from the inside. The cassette recorder sat beside it, tape still spinning though it was long out of film, and Dr. Frost was gone. The only trace she left was a half-filled notebook on her desk, pages torn and scattered. The final entry read, "She's not inside the clock. The clock is inside her." The museum incident. By 2004, the clock had found its way to the Savannah Historical Museum through an anonymous donation. It was placed in the Civil War wing, labeled as Recovered Grandfather Clock, circa 1850s, Ashwood Plantation, Burke County. For a while, it drew little attention. Visitors passed by, reading the placard without interest, until the lights in that section began to flicker every night, always at the same time. 11:59 p.m. Security guards reported hearing faint ticking even when the clock's hands were still. One guard, Dennis Hall, claimed he saw a reflection move behind the glass, a pale face, its mouth sealed shut, its eyes wide with silent rage. That he quit the next morning. A week later, a school tour came through. When a child placed her hand against the glass, she screamed and fainted. The teachers rushed her to the nurse's office, but when she woke up, she told them quietly. She asked me what time it was. The curator's note. The museum's curator, Rachel Duvall, wrote a private memo to the board after the incident that it was never meant for public release, but a copy surfaced years later among archived letters. I've handled dozens of artifacts associated with trauma, slave shackles, death masks, battlefield relics, but nothing has ever felt like this. The clock exudes something, alive. A kind of pressure in the air around it. When you stand too close, your heart rate changes. The pendulum's rhythm seems to match it. Last night, I stayed late to observe it under controlled conditions. The room was sealed. No airflow, no light fluctuations. At 11:59, it began to chime on its own. It chimed 12 times. But each chime came slower than the last, until the 12th was almost a groan. The sound seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. I left immediately. But before I closed the door, I heard a whisper, "The hour's not done." The board dismissed her concerns, calling it atmospheric coincidence. The clock was relocated to a private exhibit and kept behind locked glass. Within 3 months, 3 more employees resigned. The documentary. In 2012, a small film crew from a YouTube series called Southern Haunts was granted access to the museum after hours. Their goal was simple: capture paranormal activity on tape. The footage they shot that night was never uploaded, but one clip, leaked anonymously a year later, showed a single scene. The host, standing before the clock, laughs nervously into the camera. Behind him, the clock's hands move slowly to 11:59. He turns to remark on it, and in that split second, before the footage cuts out, a reflection appears in the glass. Not his. A woman's. She's wearing a long black dress, her face is pale, eyes hollow, her mouth moves silently, forming 3 words before the feed ends: "You turned it on." The channel went dark days later. No explanation was given. The Collector's Warehouse. By 2019, the clock was pulled from public display and sold privately to a warehouse in Louisiana belonging to Landsman and Company, a company that handled museum storage. The clock was tagged, cataloged, and sealed in crate #4492. In 2020, during an overnight inventory, a warehouse worker named Derek Miles noticed something strange on the temperature sensors. The unit containing the clock registered 7 degrees colder than the rest of the building, and yet, the humidity sensor recorded breathing. When Miles opened the crate, he found the clock still intact, but its glass was completely opaque from condensation. Inside the fog, faintly, he could see movement. He leaned closer. That's when the glass cracked. From the inside. He fell backward, cutting his arm on a crate corner. When he looked again, the crack was gone. The next day, he called in sick. 2 days later, he disappeared. The security cameras from that night showed nothing, except at 11:59 p.m., when for exactly 60 seconds, every camera in the warehouse went black. When they came back online, the clock was gone. The final entry. 6 months later, a small antique shop in Savannah's historic district posted an online listing: "Antique oak clock, 19th century craftsmanship, still runs perfectly. Asking $2,500. The listing went up at 11:45 p.m. By 12:01 a.m., it was deleted. The shop owner, when asked, said she never posted it, but when police searched her storage room, they found something in the corner beneath a tarp. A large clock, its brass face was cracked, its hands frozen at 11:59. And carved into the wood above the dial were 4 new words, gouged deep by something sharp: "The widow still waits." The shop closed within the week. Locals say that if you walk past it at midnight, You can still hear the ticking from inside. Some say it's just pipes or old wood, but others, especially those who grew up near Burke County, know better. They say the sound isn't from the clock at all. It's from beneath it, and if you listen long enough, beneath the rhythm of the ticking, you'll hear another sound, a faint, patient heartbeat, waiting. It's just an abandoned plantation, said Ryan Maddox, tightening his GoPro harness as the van bounced down the dirt road. His crew, 3 college friends who ran a small paranormal channel called Ghost Signal, laughed in nervous excitement that they'd chased dozens of urban legends before, haunted tunnels, derelict hospitals, cursed bridges, but tonight was different. This one felt heavier. Ashwood Hall. The name alone carried whispers in the online horror forums. A plantation that burned twice and was never rebuilt. A clock that reappeared across centuries. A woman in black, waiting for midnight, the perfect clickbait. Or so they thought. The setup, their gear was basic: 3 headlamps, night vision cameras, EMF meters, and a drone. They parked near the edge of a half-flooded dirt trail, the remains of the hall visible through the trees, a skeletal ruin of stone and vine, its chimney still standing like a tombstone. "All right, guys," Ryan said, turning to his lens, "tonight we're investigating what locals call the widow of Ashwood Hall. There's been sightings of lights, cold spots, and even, get this, ticking sounds. If you're watching this live, smash that like button and tell us what you hear." The stream counter blinked, 5,200 viewers and climbing. The chat scrolled fast, skeptics, thrill seekers, believers all piling in. "This is fake AF. Turn up the gain, I hear something. Look behind you." Their laughter filled the night, nervous, but confident that they'd done this before. Nothing ever happened, until tonight. Inside the ruins they entered through what used to be the front hall, its once grand staircase now reduced to a spine of rotten wood. The air was thick and cold, like stepping into a cave. Ryan's flashlight beam caught faint carvings on the wall. "Ashwood Hall, 1853, creepy, right?" he said, panning the camera. "Locals say the lady of the house went mad after the fire. Some say she cursed her own family clock." As he said it, something faint echoed through the static of his mic. Tick, tick, soft, steady, mechanical. Jenna, the sound tech, froze. "You guys hear that?" Everyone stopped. The chat exploded. "That's a heartbeat. It's the clock. Run, idiots." They followed the sound deeper into the ruins, down what used to be a cellar entrance. It grew louder. Tick-tock, tick-tock, filling the narrow passage like it was alive. The clock returns. In the farthest corner of the cellar, half buried in ash and mud, stood a wooden crate. Ryan brushed it clean and shined his light on it. The label, nearly eaten by rot, read, "Property of Landsman and Company. Hashtag 4492." Jenna gasped. "That's the same number from the museum logs, right? From Savannah?" Ryan frowned. "Yeah, how'd it get here?" Before anyone could answer, the ticking stopped. Silence, then a faint chime rang out, low, warped, metallic, once, twice. 11 times. They looked at each other. "Don't tell me," Jenna whispered. Ryan checked his phone. 11:59 p.m. The feed glitches. The live stream feed stuttered. The comments went wild. "It's freezing up. I can still hear the clock. There's someone behind you." But when Ryan turned, no one was there, just the beam of his flashlight cutting through dust motes. Then Mason, their cameraman, shouted, "Guys, the counter's still going up." The live viewer count had jumped to 19,000, then 50,000, then 120,000. But none of them recognized the usernames filling the chat. Strings of random letters, numbers, and old-fashioned names like Agnes, Judah, Clementine, and every single one of them typed the same phrase: "She's awake." The breathing. The crate trembled. A thin crack ran along the top, releasing a faint hiss, like an exhale that had waited too long. Cold air flooded the room. Mason's camera shook. "Dude, this isn't funny." "What is that?" Ryan leaned closer. "It's just gas, right?" Then something touched his shoulder. He spun around. No one there, but the camera caught it. A pale, translucent hand resting briefly on his jacket before vanishing. The chat erupted. "OMG, rewind that. She touched him." The clock moved. And it did. The hands shifted, slowly, deliberately, until both pointed to 12. The woman in black. The moment the 12th chime began, the cellar lights dimmed to nothing. Jenna's camera switched to night vision automatically. Through the eerie green tint, they saw her, a tall woman in a dark gown, motionless in the corner, her hair hung in damp ropes. Her eyes were open, but hollow. Mason whispered, "Ryan, that's not." But she turned her head toward them. "You brought the light back." Her voice echoed through every mic, every stream, every phone speaker of their 200,000 plus live viewers. Ryan screamed, "End the stream. End it now." Jenna dropped her phone, its camera catching the last image, the clock face splitting open like a mouth, gears twisting, glass shattering outward, and then, black. The aftermath. The next morning, local police found the van still parked by the road, engine cold. The stream was still online, stuck at 3 hours 12 minutes, the last frame frozen mid-scream. No one ever found the crew, not their gear, not their bodies. But 2 weeks later, someone uploaded a new video to Ghost Signals channel. Title. Description: just a single minute of footage, the camera facing a dark hallway, faint ticking in the background, and a woman's voice whispering, "The hour's not done." Then the feed ends with the sound of a chime, and a faint reflection in the glass showing 4 faces, staring in silent terror. The Ghost Signal livestream should have ended when the feed cut out, but it didn't. For almost 6 days, the stream stayed online, blank screen, no sound. Viewers assumed it was a glitch, or a publicity stunt, but then, on the 7th day, the feed came back. At first, it was just static, gray noise rolling like ocean surf. Then the picture flickered, stabilizing on an image of the Ashwood cellar, now empty. The crate was gone. The clock was gone, and a faint tick-tock bled through the distortion. No one was behind the camera, yet the lens began to move, slowly panning toward the stairs. In the live chat, messages poured in. "This is pre-recorded. Why is it still streaming? I hear breathing." Someone wrote, "Look closer at the walls." When viewers brightened their screens, they saw handprints, hundreds of them, pressed into the ash, as if people had tried to climb out of the earth itself. The investigation. By morning, YouTube moderators had taken the stream offline, but thousands of users had already downloaded copies, circulating them on mirror sites. Clips appeared on Reddit, TikTok, and obscure paranormal forums. The views climbed past 10 million in a week. That's when FBI cybercrime analyst Dana Rivers got the call. At first, she treated it like another hoax, missing influencers, viral ghost story, unsourced video. But when her team examined the metadata, they found something impossible. The original upload location wasn't Georgia. It was Washington, D.C., from a dormant government IP block, one decommissioned in 1987. And embedded in the file's audio waveform were ultrasonic pulses, repeating in 12-second intervals. Each pulse formed a pattern, an almost human heartbeat. When the lab technicians slowed it down, they heard a voice, "You brought the light back." The viral haunting. Within 2 weeks, devices around the country began to act strange. People who'd watched the video reported the same phenomenon: clocks freezing at 11:59 p.m., phones switching on by themselves, voices whispering from earbuds when no audio played. A popular tech reviewer posted that his smartwatch ticked without rhythm. After viewing the footage, he laughed it off during a live stream, until his camera glitched, and a pale woman appeared behind him for half a second. The clip hit 24 million views overnight. The next morning, his channel was gone. So was he. The recovery team. The government called in a digital forensics unit led by Major Elena Cross, a veteran of cyberterrorism cases. Her team traced the source data to a corrupted storage drive at a data farm outside Savannah. Inside one of the racks, they found a metallic clock face, welded into the cooling system, its brass corroded, but its hands still moving. The timestamp on the server logs, 11:59 p.m., looping indefinitely. Cross ordered the entire rack isolated, but before power could be cut, the building lights flickered, and every monitor displayed the same words, "The widow still waits." Moments later, the power failed, the backup generators refused to start, and over the emergency radio, they heard ticking, not from speakers, from the walls. The journalist. While authorities contained the site, independent journalist Michael Haynes was already chasing the story. He'd covered supernatural legends before, but this was the first time a ghost story had source code. He reached out to locals in Burke County, finding fragments of testimony, old letters, oral histories, church records. Every mention of Ashwood connected to one name, Eleanor Marchand, the last recorded mistress of the hall. her death certificate listed no cause, just one word, unfinished. Haynes compiled his findings into a documentary titled The Widow Network. He uploaded it to a private server at 11:30 p.m. At 11:59, his system logged an unauthorized access. Security footage later showed his office lights dimming, and his monitor displaying a single frame of the old clock. When police entered the room, his chair was empty, but his computer continued typing on its own, letters forming slowly on screen, the hours not done. The digital curse experts began calling it the first, mimetic haunting, a ghost not bound to space, but to information itself. Every time someone watched or copied the video, fragments of the signal embedded in their device, the pattern spread like malware, infecting networks, backup drives, even offline archives. No one could fully erase it. And every fragment contained the same faint ticking. A special task force attempted a full data purge codenamed Operation Midnight. They built an air-gapped server room underground and funneled every trace of the ghost signal video inside. Then they powered it down. For 12 hours, silence. Then one of the engineers heard something echoing through the vent system. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The lights came on by themselves. Every clock in the facility displayed 11:59. The last transmission weeks later, a broadcast appeared on shortwave radio frequencies across the East Coast, unregistered, untraceable. It repeated on loop, the hours not done, the hours not done. Embedded in the signal was the same spectral voice, distorted, female, calm, and between phrases, faint screams. Analysts noticed something else. The transmission grew louder near the old Ashwood grounds. A drone sweep detected heat signatures. Though the area was deserted, the infrared camera caught a shape, a tall, humanoid outline standing where the hall once stood, facing the sky as if listening. At 11:59 p.m., the outline raised an arm, and every radio tower within 20 miles went silent. The historians note in 2025, Emory University quietly reopened Dr. Lillian Frost's case files. Inside her recovered notebook was one final page no one had noticed before. It contained a single equation, time, light, and sound mapped into a spiral. Beneath it, her handwriting read, "The widow was never bound to the clock. The clock was her doorway. Every repetition keeps it open." The page ends with an unfinished sentence. When the light blinks 12, and the ink trails off, the present day now. Online forums still share the ghost signal mirror links. Most are dead, but a few, hidden in corners of the web, still play short clips. The cellar, the whisper, the crack of glass. If you watch long enough, some users say, the frame freezes, your screen darkens, and you'll see your own reflection. Except the eyes aren't yours. At that moment, the clock on your device reads 11:59 p.m. No matter the time zone. Then, from your speakers, faintly, you brought the light back. The countdown. There's a reason most people refuse to talk about the widow now. It's not fear of her, it's fear of spreading her. They say she's become a pattern, a signal, a rhythm that mimics life itself. And like any rhythm, it only needs one thing to continue: someone to listen. Because every story retold, every recording replayed, every tick echoed into the dark, is one more second on her clock point, one more turn of the pendulum. And when it strikes 12, she walks again. The air over Burke County had changed. Locals said it smelled different now, not like swamp and pine, but like dust after lightning, the kind of smell that lingered after something unnatural had burned and didn't quite go out. By 2026, Ashwood Hall no longer appeared on maps. Satellite imagery blurred the area automatically, the result of data corruption, though no one could fix it. But travelers on the Ojiki backroad swore they could still see the outline of its foundation in the moonlight. And at exactly 11:59 p.m., a faint ticking came from beneath the soil. The historian's journal. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Cross, a cultural historian from Emory University, no relation to Major Elena Cross, though the coincidence unsettled her colleagues. Evelyn specialized in cursed histories, the stories people tried to forget. When she heard of the widow of Ashwood, she thought it was folklore. Until she received a small box in the mail. No return address, just a date written on the side, October 31st. 2025. Inside the box were a cracked brass clock face. A USB drive labeled the hour, and a handwritten note. She's still waiting for someone to close the door. Evelyn didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in patterns, and this one was repeating the same cycle of tragedy, investigation, disappearance, and silence, always ending at 11:59 p.m. So she began her own record. Evelyn's audio log, entry 01 inch. This is Dr. Evelyn Cross, date, March 2, 2026. Subject: Ashwood residual phenomena. I've spent 2 weeks analyzing the recovered ghost signal data. The code isn't just corrupted, it's alive. It rewrites itself every 12 minutes, shifting metadata like a living organism. Each iteration adds a small timestamp, 11:59. I think it's counting down. But to what, I'm not sure. The return to the grounds on March 13, Evelyn drove to Burke County. The road to the old plantation site was overgrown, but still there, a line of dirt carved through decades of forest. Locals warned her not to go after sunset. An old man at the gas station said quietly, "That place ain't empty, ma'am, you hear her clock, you run." But Evelyn didn't run. She arrived just before dusk, parked by the field where Ashwood once stood, and began recording. She spoke softly into her camera. "The air pressure's strange here. My compass spins when I approach the center. There's static on every device I've tried." The camera panned across the clearing, charred brick, broken glass, a fragment of wrought iron gate. Then, from the shadows, came a sound, not loud, not sudden, just tick, tock, tick, tock. She froze. The sound wasn't echoing through the air. It was vibrating inside her recorder. Evelyn's audio log, entry 04 inch. Something's different. The ticking doesn't stay in one direction anymore. It moves closer, then away. I measured intervals of 12.4 seconds between shifts. I think it's searching. When she reviewed her recordings that night, Evelyn noticed a shape in one frame of the footage. At the edge of the clearing, beneath the outline of a dead oak tree, stood a figure in white, too far to see clearly, but the silhouette was unmistakable, tall, draped, unmoving. She rewound the tape. The figure wasn't there before. Only after the clock ticked 12 times, the midnight broadcast on her 5th night at the site. Evelyn left her camera running and climbed into her car to rest. At exactly 11:59 p.m., the radio came on by itself. A woman's voice whispered through the static, "You brought the light back." Then the clock on the dashboard froze at 11:59. The engine died, the headlights dimmed, and in the reflection of the windshield, Evelyn saw someone standing behind her car. She turned, no one there. When the lights flickered again, her dash cam captured a single frame, the same albino face once rumored to haunt the 1853 plantations, pale, unblinking, and faintly smiling. The letter Evelyn's body was never found, but a week later, her university received a sealed envelope with her name typed neatly on it. Inside was one printed letter, no return address, no fingerprint residue. It read, "I found the source. The widow was never just Eleanor Marchand, she was the echo of every soul that died here. The clock wasn't built to mark time, it was built to trap it. Every 11:59, the world repeats one breath too long, and in that breath, she walks. I think I saw her, but she didn't look angry. She looked unfinished. If you hear the ticking, don't stop it, let it reach 12. Maybe that's the only way to end her story." The bottom of the page was signed E.C. The government file declassified 6 months later. The file, Ashwood Terminus, detailed the recovery of a corrupted video from a private cloud server. When viewed frame by frame, the footage showed Evelyn standing in the field, holding the brass clock face from the box. She whispered something before the feed cut out. Lip readers later confirmed her final words, "It's time." Then, for the first time in 2 centuries, the Ashwood ticking stopped. Every file connected to the Widow network went blank simultaneously. No static. No heartbeat. No clock, just silence. But silence isn't empty. 3 days later, across the eastern seaboard, smart devices rebooted at midnight. Every screen flashed for a second, showing only the number 12:00 a.m., nothing unusual. Until one user slowed the footage down 100x. Between 11:59 and 12 o'clock, for exactly 1 frame, the display showed the outline of a woman's hand resting on glass. Then, faintly beneath the audio spectrum, the whisper, "Thank you." The archive room in a dim government storage facility outside Atlanta. The recovered Ashwood clock sits behind bulletproof glass. It's inert now, no ticking, no glow, but the guards say sometimes, when storms roll through, it vibrates faintly, like something inside it still remembers the rhythm. A brass plate below it reads, "The widow of Ashwood Hall recovered 1853-2026 containment status, dormant." But below that, scratched faintly into the glass, Our words no one admits carving, time is never finished. Final broadcast on the anniversary of the first disappearance, January 7th, a podcast called Liturgy of Fear released a special episode titled The Last Light at Ashwood. The host's voice sounded calm, scholarly, familiar, but listeners noticed something strange. The host identified herself as Dr. Evelyn Cross. "If you're hearing this," she said, "you've kept the light alive." Maybe that's what she wanted. Not revenge, not release, just remembrance. Then came a faint ticking tick, tock, tick, tock. "The story's over," she whispered, "but stories don't die. They wait." The episode ended abruptly at 11:59 p.m., the next one never uploaded. Epilogue. The second handsome say Evelyn succeeded, that letting the clock strike 12 finally released the widow and ended the curse. Others believe she only reset it, that every telling of the story, every upload, every voiceover keeps the pendulum swinging. And now, if you've listened this far, if you've heard her voice through your speakers, you've joined the rhythm too. Check your clock. What time is it? If it says 11:59. Don't panic. Don't speak, just listen, because somewhere, deep inside the circuits and shadows of your screen, a pale hand rests against glass, waiting for one more story, one more retelling, one more second, and when the clock strikes 12, she'll finally step through.